time, and I call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Safeguard Mechanism Crediting Amendment Bill. I do note, I'd like to start by noting that it is disappointing how many in this place on both sides have really talked politics rather than specifics about the legislations and how it could be improved. And, for example, members of government, like the member for Bennelong, to actually engage with amendments that have been tabled and presented and actually say whether or not they intend to support them or argue for them in the caucus room, because that's what the public ultimately wants to know. Since 2019, it has absolutely been my focus to champion stronger action on climate change and put forward sensible solutions that should be able to be bipartisan. Put forward a climate change bill that in fact would have made it not necessary to have this mechanism, because it would have ensured that we would have had industry sector clear guidance on pathways to decarbonisation from an independent climate change commission, and that is a proven method in other countries like in the UK. Unfortunately, that wasn't progressed by the government, and so here we are tinkering around the edges of a policy that my predecessor in Warringah implemented when he dismantled the carbon pollution reduction scheme. And we know it is a far from perfect method. In fact, it has really failed to deliver any significant emissions reduction in the heavy industry sector. But that said, if done right, the safeguard mechanism has the potential to significantly contribute to the achievement of emissions reduction targets. It does cover in Australia facilities that emit over 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. Now, these are the biggest emitters in the country, excluding the power companies. Now, there is some argument that, in fact, this should be extended to more facilities that are high emitters and that they should be captured. Now, we know there's about 215 facilities included at present, and about 20% of it represents about 20% of our national emissions. Now, it's difficult to comment with finality on the bill because we don't know ultimately where it will end up, and there are still conversations, myself with the Minister and Government and other members of the crossbench and the Greens in both houses, this House and the other place as well. But it is important to point out that the Safeguard Mechanism Bill, it's an important pillar of the government's climate policy. And now we know we had to push the government to acknowledge that the 43% emissions reduction by 2030 was really a floor, not a ceiling, that we have to be more ambitious than that, which means the levers we put in place, this very pillar to deliver the government policy, has to be capable of greater ambition. And that's why so many of the amendments are important. What this bill does, to cut it really through the thick and all the explanations, is it sets up a safeguard mechanism credits as a new form of incentive to help large emitters accelerate decarbonisation. If they overachieve their emissions reduction beyond the 4.9% per annum baseline set by the government, then they are given a credit that can be traded to other safeguard facilities at market price. This is a good initiative and one that rewards actual abatement. From there, things get a little bit more complicated. The regulations and rules around this are still being developed, and while there has been good progress and discussions with government, it's still not sufficient. So I welcome the consultation process that has occurred so far, but we need to point out that there is room for more ambitious targets if we are genuine in committing to the Paris Agreement and the target temperatures of close to 1.5 degrees. In all this discussion, apart from the political grandstanding that goes on in this place, we have to remember what the ultimate goal is, which is keeping warming to a livable status to make sure that we have stable environments and our communities and way of life can continue. That has to ultimately be the goal. The 30% reduction of emissions from safeguard facilities by 2030 is good, but it really should have been 30% from 2005 levels, like all other emissions, not from today's level. That's again the devil's always in the detail of just what you're requiring the industry players to do. Adjustments to baselines for emissions for safeguard facilities, and that new facilities will have baselines set in accordance with global best practice. That is a good thing. And the initiative to set 5-year budgets for safeguard facilities post-2030, which in fact is in line with the carbon budgeting approach proposed in my own climate change bill. However, the mechanism does have some gaps. It must address gross emissions. We must prioritise real abatement over purchase of offsets, especially for coal and gas facilities. The mechanism should set a higher decline rate for coal and gas facilities. I totally accept that for about 50% of facilities, the heavy industry from steel, from ammonia, from cement, concrete, incredibly difficult. But for coal and gas, it is not, and they should be able to have higher decline rates, and it should be put there. We should not be allowing unfettered use of carbon offsets to achieve reductions, again, in particular for coal and gas facilities. And new fossil fuel entrants should enter the scheme net neutral. They should be displacing high-emitting alternatives. And finally, we must improve methane measurement, reporting and validation, and set these facilities on a path to minimising emissions and capturing methane. Methane is 26 to 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide in capturing heat and creating global heating, and so up to 80 times more potent over the first 20 years of emission. This must be a priority for all these facilities. I'm pleased to hear the government contemplate that there will be a cap on net total emissions for safeguard facilities. That can have a meaningful impact in terms of controlling total emissions from our largest polluters and restricting new entrants. But let's get real. That number on paper in a discussion paper does nothing. It has to make its way into the legislation or even the regulations and to have some accountability and to ensure some transparency of achievement. And the number of 1,233 million tonnes of net emissions is far too great, because what it's done is allowed growth, room for growth in emissions and new entrants. And the Minister himself has said there is a buffer zone built into this to allow for new projects. It allows for at least 3 large new gas projects to come online, some Pluto, Browse and Barossa, Western Australian projects, despite the fact that the International Energy Agency tells us no new coal and gas to have a chance of staying at close to 1.5 degrees. And modelling from Reputex shows that the potential for new entrants, especially fossil fuel producers, risk blowing out that budget and our 2030 target with it. The modelling shows that from financially committed new projects will be substantial, totalling some 56.6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, leading to the budget being exceeded by 13 to 35 million tonnes. Now, the Minister and the government dispute that, but what we should be doing is requiring new fossil fuel entrants to come online net neutral. We need to ensure that they are not adding to emissions and that they don't force other facilities covered by the mechanism to work harder to keep within the overall budget. It pits fossil fuel new entrants against potential growth industries in critical minerals and manufacturing. And we've got cement and steel smelters, fertilisers. These are industries that will remain in the future. We need to invest in new energy sources to support their transition, not make their life harder by continuing to approve the fossil fuel projects that will increase our emissions but have limited lifespan. The new mechanism allows for unfettered use of offsets to achieve reductions. This is concerning and creates a disincentive to invest in on-site abatement and real decarbonisation. And it might, in fact, encourage some facilities to wait when we know there is urgency. In other countries, such as in the US, they are moving on and investing in important new industries such as green hydrogen. The unlimited use of offsets in Australia provides companies the opportunities to wait on decarbonisation and invest in offsets rather than investing in the inevitable technology and actually abate emissions. What we should be doing is working with industry to bring down the cost of green hydrogen as an input and creating incentives for business to decarbonise now, accelerating the transition and not have any incentive for facilities to wait. Capping the offsets at $75 per tonne allows industry to pay their way out of cutting emissions more cheaply than the market may otherwise determine, and that's concerning. There could be a shortage of credible offsets in the market. And just a few days ago, in fact, New South Wales Treasury, they recommended including carbon emission pricing in line with the EU emissions trading scheme that is currently at $123 per tonne and rising in real terms. So the escalating cost of offset is more reflective of current market demand for offsets, and it will require, I think it will incentivise the creation of offsets as well as for industry to actually invest. We must implement the recommendations of the Chubb review as a matter of urgency to boost the integrity of the scheme, to ensure that facilities are investing in quality offsets, because if not, all of this is an accounting trick. It won't add up to anything, and we will have an escalating disaster when it comes to our emissions. The bill itself does establish a new form of offset, the Safeguard Mechanism credit, which is a good thing. This is granted when a facility achieves reductions in emissions greater than the 4.9% decline rate. It is a good thing. We want to incentivise accelerated emissions reduction. The legislation needs to establish a hierarchy of emissions reduction for first, on-site real abatement, secondly, offset projects, and lastly, as a last resort, purchase of offsets. SMCs represent real gross reductions in emissions, that is Safeguard Mechanism credits, and that is what we should be aiming for and prioritising. Lastly, it's very important that we address methane. A key gap in this proposed legislation so far is greater transparency and accountability for methane emissions by the designated facilities. Last year, Australia signed up to the Global Methane Pledge to cut 30% methane emissions by 2030. Most people think methane just comes from agriculture, and we have this ridiculous discussion of barbecues and farting cows. What we really need to talk about is fossil fuel mining creates 40% of our methane emissions, and we absolutely can do something about this. And this legislation is a mechanism by which we can absolutely do that.
Order. It being 7:30 p.m, I propose